Universidad Militar Nueva Granada in Bogotá, Colombia. This initiative came to have this joint webinar comes from the Asociación Latinoamericana de Botánica, and we're joined by the Association of Tropical Biology and Conservation and the International Association of Plant Taxonomy. Today, we have 4 speakers and 1 bright moderator accompanying us to talk about a critical view on global initiatives on biodiversity and conservation. So our first speaker is Cristina Lopez from Universidad de Antioquia. Then we'll have Jeff Corbin from Union College in the United States, Daniela Zappi from Universidade Militar Federal do Recôncavo da Bahia, and Jonas Gelman from University of Copenhagen. And our moderator will be Ana Rita Simões from the Missouri Botanical Garden. I'll give you a longer introduction when I introduce each of their talks. We are recording today, and I'm going to pass on to Gustavo Chimizo from the International Plant Association, Plant Taxonomy. Go ahead.
Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you all for joining us, and the great speakers that we have today. And I'm the social media manager of the IAPT. So we are an international association that supports global taxonomy and systematics of algae, fungi, and plants. And we are very happy to integrate these 3 associations and all the others audience together today. Thank you. Alejandra.
Mariana.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Mariana Soto. I'm from, I'm the communications coordinator of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation. We are an international scientific society with more than 60 years, and we are a global, where our members come from more than 70 countries, and we are a community of researchers, scientists, and students that works on conservation and tropical biology, especially in the tropics. So welcome, and well, we invite you to be an ATBC member, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Mariana. We had 495 around people registered for today from about 88 countries. So we are having people from all over the world joining us today for this discussion on global conservation initiatives. So our first speaker is Cristina Lopez from Universidad de Antioquia in Colombia, and she will talk about how does appropriate planning improve conservation outcomes. So welcome, Cristina. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Alejandra, and everybody for the invitation. It's very nice to be here with all these academic communities to talk about conservation. I'm sure the discussion is going to be very interesting. I'm going to be talking about planning and how that can help improve conservation outcomes. And particularly, I'm going to be focusing on species conservation, and I'm going to talk about plants a lot because I do work with plants. So I hope it will be interesting for many of the people here. And I want to start by saying that we actually have good evidence that conservation planning is very important for conservation success. And this might seem trivial to some people, but actually you will be surprised at how many of the conservation interventions that we do all over the world do not have proper planning, or sometimes they just don't take into account the things that have been executed in the past in that scenario or that landscape. So actually conservation planning is something we need to keep pushing and promoting, because it's really key for conservation success. There's actually a study carried out by the Conservation Planning Specialist Group of IUCN, in which they use 45 species with very good long-term data on their population trends. And they actually demonstrated, or they suggested with the analysis, that for all those species, when the conservation planning was done and the conservation action started to be implemented in a more strategic way for all the species, the conservation outcome was actually improved in comparison to the species where no conservation planning has been done. Now, we need to say that the conservation outcomes actually started to be noticeable after 10 or more than 10 years of conservation plan action. So, you need to keep in mind that this can be in the long term. You need to actually monitor species for the long term to see these effects. There's thankfully now more attention and actually more resources trying to be invested in good conservation planning and conservation action. Reverse the Red, for example, is an initiative that started in a UCN, but is now a coalition of many conservation NGOs and institutions like botanical gardens and zoos and aquariums and many other collectives that actually are working for species conservation. And the Reverse the Red movement is mobilizing expertise and resources, but it's also been very important in sharing success stories. There's plenty of stories when we can demonstrate that by doing good planning and being strategic in the conservation implementation, we can actually improve the status of a species. Conservation can work, and we actually are doing it right now and have been doing it for many years in many cases. So within the global biodiversity framework, which is, the global agenda for biodiversity within the Convention of Biological Diversity, we have a few targets that are related to species conservation, but particularly Target 4 is focused on halting extinction, on protecting genetic diversity, and managing human-wildlife conflict. And what we have seen is that many countries are a little bit struggling in particularly trying to focus efforts on species conservation. So within Reverse the Red and IUCN and other institutions, we are actually trying to promote methodologies to prioritize species and to do more conservation planning so we can actually deliver outcomes in 2030. So very soon, for at least some of the species that require what we call urgent species targeted recovery actions. So this is, for example, a paper estimating the number of species that require targeted recovery action, that is conservation actions that go beyond protecting the habitat, specifically to reduce the extinction risk of a species. And we can already tell that more than half of the threatened species identified so far require these recovery actions that are very specific. This is another paper that was actually looked only at the critically endangered species, or the ones that are in highest risk of extinction. And we know that more than 4,000 of those species actually require very targeted interventions, and they're in very specific places and ecosystems around the world. Within the Species Survival Commission of IUCN, we have our working model that is called the Species Conservation Cycle, in which we implement actions in terms of assessing the status of a species to actually, gather all the knowledge so we can do proper planning. And then after the planning, we can actually execute very, targeted strategic conservation actions. And, we're moving along this conservation cycle for many of the species in the world. Of course, most of the information is for vertebrate animals, but we are improving, the information and all this cycle of assessing, planning, and acting for many other species around the world. Within this commission in IUCN, we have more than 200 specialist groups and more than 30 Center for Species Survivals focusing on this. We also have a global species action plan that is actually designed to help countries or institutions address Target 4 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And one of the main tools we use to do proper conservation planning is, of course, prioritizing species. So the main tool we use is the red list of certain species. We have to say that, it's about a little bit more than 200,000 species have been assessed for the red list. That is less than 10% of the known species to science. So we still need to do a lot more assessing, but we have identified so far almost 50,000 species in risk of extinction. And again, the vertebrates are very well assessed in general, but all other animals are not. And then for plants, we actually have less than 20% of the species of the world assessed. And for fungi, we have less than 1%. So we need more of these, but we already have some information about the threatened species. And very briefly, we use criteria related to species distributions and population sizes, population dynamics, where that information is available. And we use specific parameters with quantitative thresholds to identify the risk of extinction of a species and then classify it in different categories, what we call the threatened categories. And in some cases, if you have red list assessments carried out in several points in time, we can calculate what we call the red list index, and we can actually see if the general status of a group of species in terms of the risk of extinction is improving or not through time, and that will help us, of course, in planning. We also have now a tool called the green status of a species. So it's an assessment that is complementary to the red list. In the red list, we're trying to understand the problems, the threats, what's going on with the species that is increasing the risk of extinction. With the green status, we actually try to evaluate how the impact of conservation actions in the past has helped recover the species. And actually, we do counterfactuals to see or to try to estimate how conservation actions in the future could help recover and how much recovery we could accomplish for a species. So this is a very important tool to actually show how conservation actions are actually important in terms of legacy, but also in terms of what we can do towards the future, and it's becoming more and more important for conservation planning. In some cases, for some species, we do have detailed information about population sizes or even population dynamics, in which case we can actually we can use population modeling. We have tools, for example, the conservation planning specialist groups has a software called Vortex, in which you can use these population models to evaluate different scenarios for the impacts of threats, for example, but you can also do scenarios for the impact of different conservation strategies, and that will obviously help also with the conservation planning. There's also very detailed standards and protocols for what we call conservation action plans. So, with all the information that you cover with the assessments, then you can actually plan very specific actions with, targets, indicators, and a monitoring plan. So you can actually track the progress and within the framework of adaptive management, try to improve and deliver the best conservation outcomes that you can. And briefly, a couple of examples from Colombia. This is the work of the Colombian Plant Specialist Group. of IUCN. What we're doing here in Colombia is that we're progressing with the red list. We have more than 27,000 species of plants in the country. We have done assessments for about 6,000 of them. And with that information, we're identifying very specific important sites for plant conservation, particularly using the standard of key biodiversity areas. And for some of the groups that are require more urgent action, we have conservation plans. For example, we have a group like cycads in Colombia. This is a very small group, only 28 species in the country. And for many of them, we have relatively good information about the distribution, the population status. For many of them, we have monitoring programs. So we have information on population dynamics. And, for the 15 threatened species that we have in the country, we actually design a very detailed conservation plan with actions that have to do with research and monitoring in situ and ex situ, conservation action, in some cases sustainable use actions, also actions on communication, education, enabling instruments. And we have been implementing this conservation plan for the last 10 years with various degrees of success in the different targets. But this one is very specific with a lot of knowledge. It's not perfect, but we're getting a lot of success with this one. But in the other end, we have a conservation plan that is for all the trees of Colombia. We have more than 6,000 species of trees in Colombia. So we have done the red list for most of them, 85% of them, and we have identified so far more than 700 threatened species. But in this case, for most of them, we only know locations, geographic locations, occurrences. We don't have information on population sizes or population status, but at least we know which ones are in higher need of conservation and where the populations are. So in this case, after we have identified the threatened species, what we did is that we did a prioritization of a species using the criteria for conservation needs. That is, the species that have that have a lot of decline or very, high threats that are very drastic, but also we use criteria for conservation opportunities because we need to be pragmatic and we need to deliver conservation outcomes as soon as possible. So we identify species, for example, that are of interest already to environmental authorities or local communities, or species that already have propagation protocols or other basic information we can use for recovery. And we have a list of 100 species that are the ones that we're prioritizing for the species actions in the next 5 years. We also have identified sites where we have 10 or more threatened species, so we know that we can work there and improve outcomes because we have many species there and things like that. So to finish, I just want to say that we still have a lot of challenges. This is a paper where we call the biodiversity paradox, in which you can see, that in many countries with a lot of species and biodiversity, we don't have a lot of expertise or institutional support for conservation. Brazil and Colombia might be, or South Africa might be exceptions, or some other countries in the global north. But there's a lot of countries that have a lot of biodiversity, not enough expertise, not enough institutional support, and certainly not enough funding and resources. And I think the academic community, like you, the people that are here, can help in providing more expertise and maybe more institutional support in some cases to keep, doing more conservation planning and improving conservation outcomes for species and biodiversity in general. So thank you, and stop there. Oh, sorry. There you go.
Thank you very much, Cristina, for a nice overview of the standards and for interesting information about how is conservation planning in Colombia going. Our next speaker is Jeff Corbin from Union College in the United States. Jeff's title is Confronting Invasive Species, Coordinated Strategies to Close Pathways of Introduction. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Great.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much, Alejandra, and everybody for joining on this. I'm really happy to be part of this discussion. So invasive species are a key driver of the biodiversity crisis. So here, this report by the United Nations IPBES assessment concluded that up to 60% of the extinctions that we know of during the Anthropocene have, at least one of the drivers has included invasive species. And the trends over time, let's see, oops, sorry. Just blanked out of my, I'm gonna stop sharing and reshare here to be able to get that screen back for myself. Where did I go? Sorry, guys. Clicked on something and my screen went away. Are we back? Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So our trends over time are also increasing. So here for a variety of taxa, we see that the trends are increasing. And so over the time in the future, we're not just going to be dealing with the invasive species we have today, but that's likely to increase. So combating invasive species is a really key strategy here. And this is what we call the invasion curve that indicates that prevention and early detection are really key strategies to control invasive species. So on the left side of this diagram, if we can prevent species from arriving in the first place, or at least targeting them early after their arrival, we have the best chance and it's the most efficient to be able to control them. But if time goes on and they're able to gain more of a foothold and spread, then it's much more expensive and in fact more and more unlikely we're going to be able to control them, and their impacts on natural ecosystems and especially on biodiversity is going to be much greater. So we really need to focus on that prevention side of things. So invasive species are really a global issue, and national actions are certainly important. So having inspections at ports and border crossings and those kinds of things, or developing priority lists to be able to manage what is in your particular country are certainly good steps, but they're not enough because invasive species are crossing borders and neighbors are very much linked to each other. And so a number of my examples are going to be from the Western Hemisphere as a nod to some of our sponsors. I'm going to first use the border between Chile and Argentina. So this is a very long border, over 5,000 kilometers. And there are particular pathways, main border crossings, and those roads can be really key pathways for species invasions, either from Chile into Argentina or the other way. And so this study by Nico Fuentes and colleagues in 2010 carried out the following assessment. So what they did was they used weed risk assessments. That is to say, what are the risks of a species in one of the countries for species that occurred in one of those two, but not the other. So in Chile, but not in Argentina, or the other way around. And they particularly narrowed in on which were the species that were found to be risky that also occurred on roadways. And so then those border crossings would be particularly important to consider. So what they found was that there were 22 species in Chile that did not occur in Argentina that the weed risk assessment would reject, but that also occurred on roadways. Interestingly, though not so relevant for this talk, the pathways on the other way didn't seem to be as important. They didn't find any species that were currently in Argentina that could be a risk to Chile. But in any case, this information, these 22 species in Chile that Argentina should be worried about, is exactly the kind of information that binational cooperation is built on. A shared list of threats, a known pathway, and an opportunity to act before establishment. So then 15 years later, both countries have developed significant national strategies that explicitly consider both wildland plant invaders and also animals and biodiversity. But these plans were really developed on separate tracks without coordinated action across countries or consideration of these roadways and other means of exchange. And so really there remains a gap. So if this cooperation is needed, let's look at some of the frameworks for such cooperation. So the first I'll talk about is the International Plant Protection Convention, or the IPPC, established in 1951. And so today there are 185 signatories, and at its heart, they publish what are called international standards for phytosanitary measures. So this is especially relevant for agricultural products. It's really focused on diseases and pests that might attack plants of agricultural importance, including crops. But it's very important. It winds up offering guidelines and regulations and standards for pest inspections, packaging regulations, risk assessments. So this is a very effective, it's functional, and it's very widely adopted, and it's based on science. But where more could be done by the international community is to focus also on threats, that species that threaten biodiversity, namely many invasive species, including plants, can that wind up should be considered and falling under a similar kind of set of standards. So another global framework, Christina actually mentioned this, is the 2022 United Nations Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And one of the targets, Target 6, did specifically touch on invasive alien species. And so it called for eliminating, reducing, and mitigating the impacts of invasive species through pathway management, prevention, and it also focused on priority species for biodiversity conservation and priority sites, including islands and biodiversity hotspots and the like. But the only indicator for success in 2030 for this section was to reduce the rate of invasive alien species establishment. And I would argue that's a measure of the failure of what it's trying to achieve, rather than targeting the specific ways, the mechanisms by which we might be able to halt that. So better would be to have measures related to coordination between countries or closing pathways of introduction and the like. So to wrap up the global framework, we have good intentions, but there's some lacking in terms of the accountability and application to the wildland invaders that are the main threats to biodiversity. All right, so regional efforts, burrowing down a little bit more now at the regional level, we do see some examples of stronger levels of accountability and cooperation. And I'm not going to have time to be able to go over many, all of the ones that might exist, but I'm going to focus on a few. Here, the European Union is a really good model. So the European Commission has identified 114 invasive alien species that are strictly regulated, including 49 plant species. And so those species are ones that member states are required to prevent their introduction if they're not in country, and manage them if they are present in country. So this is a really good framework in that it's based on science, and the list of species is regularly updated. So this effective legal and regulatory framework that requires species to have specific regulations about them is very important. I'll say that communication is still really key, and this is a point at which the good laws and regulations can falter or can fall short of their goals. We do need to maintain good communication between those regulations and the scientists and the stakeholders, including the businesses and the importers and the exporters, and also the general public, so they understand the purpose and the impact that invasive species can wind up having for biodiversity and why it matters. Another regional cooperation, this time another example from Latin America, is the Inter-American Biodiversity Information Network's Invasives Information Network. So summarized that mouthful by I3N. And so this was a distributed network of national databases of invasive species. So what species are there, which are your priorities? And this system was funded from 2001 until 2013, and it enabled a lot of sharing of tools and connections and risk assessments across the hemisphere. And so one example of how this sort of information can be used comes from this paper by Carlos Roberto Fonseca and colleagues, where they look at overlapping threats of invasive plants in the Pampas ecosystems that overlap within Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. And they used these I3N resources in order to look at the species that were present in each country's database of invasive species that also occurred in the Pampas. And so what they found were 365 species total among all three of those species countries that occurred in the Pampas that were threats to its biodiversity. And there were 50 species that occurred in all three of the countries. So what this kind of analysis can wind up doing is that here from a quote from the discussion of the Fonseca paper is that this offers that the recognition of a common list of dangerous species can set the basis for coherent management policies in order to find more successful ways of preventing and mitigating the impact across national boundaries. So this is exactly the kind of shared scientific baseline that regional policy needs. So unfortunately, the I3N funding lapsed in 2013. Indeed, some nodes have carried on. I think one example is the Instituto Oros in Brazil. And also the Mercosur, the Southern Common Market, did adopt some of these principles and use their guidelines to develop prevention, monitoring guidelines and plans. But unlike the United Nations, the European Union's example, there's no a unified prohibition list. There are binding actions, so there is still more that can be done. So let's talk some more in kind of one of my last points is about how science can wind up filling the gaps in some of these global or regional frameworks. So scientists can provide some of the basis for action and facilitate some of this cooperation by assembling lists of invasive species where maybe countries haven't had the resources in order to be able to develop that themselves, or contribute weed risk assessments of the kind that I showed across the Chilean-Argentinian border earlier. Though I will say that a recent study that surveyed or that reviewed WRAs across the world found that 81 different countries that had carried out weed risk assessments used a total of 26 different methods. And that's a problem because if you're using different criteria for your weed risk assessment, then it gets harder to compare across countries. So there's still more room for cooperation in the WRA sphere. Okay, so anyway, here's one example of how scientists can continue to contribute that. So for the Caribbean, 2 studies, one through CABI by Witt in 2023 and another by Julissa Rojas Sandoval and her colleagues in 2024, assembled lists of invasive species within the individual locales within the Caribbean basin. And here's just one summary from the Rojas Sandoval paper, where for a variety of different plant groups, we see their prevalence in different kinds of habitat. So the prevalence of vines in rural versus forest versus dryland habitats and the like. And this is the kind of information that again can provide baselines across a region and be the basis for cooperation across the basin. So more of those kinds of contributions would be good. So to conclude, regional and international efforts, including cooperation, can work, but it's typically underfunded and it rarely includes binding actions. The European Union model, where there are consensus threats and binding actions by neighbors to deal with them, is a really good model. Let's remember the United Nations call that I showed, the Target 6, that it's looking to reduce the introduction of invasive species by 50%. We can only do that by cooperating and being proactive. So in order to basically achieve that, my calls to action would be that 1, we should fund national priority lists and risk assessments and share those results across borders to enable cooperation and cross-border consistently. Secondly, regulations for agricultural pests provide a good model for cooperation in, for example, the horticultural sphere, which is a really major pathway for the introduction of invasive plants, but for other pathways as well. Third, scientists can help bridge gaps in data and infrastructure in order to try to make up for some of the difficulties in some regions. And finally, scientists should make the case for prevention to policymakers so that more action is done at those early stages of the invasion curve and not after a species has gotten established and are so much lower. So thank you very much. And I look forward to continuing this discussion at a later point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was a very interesting talk. Plants that we don't talk often, many of us who are working with native species. So our next speaker is Daniela Zappi from Universidade Federal do Recôncavo da Bahia in Brazil. Daniela will talk about globally endangered cacti. What are the prospects of returning to the wild?
Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you for inviting me. It's a very, very interesting meeting. I would like to share my screen, but it seems that Jeff still has his up. Would that be true?
It is. Gosh, I don't think so. Is that true, Alejandra? Do you also see my screen?
No.
I seem to be unable to. Okay. Sorry. False accusation. Let's go back here and get started. Okay, so I have something quite different from the first two talks, but a lot of the points that were lifted there, that were pointed out there, are reality for this more of a case study of the cacti as one of the few families that has been globally assessed, the few families of plants. Everybody said today that the vertebrates are more known than the other animals, and the plants are somewhat intermediate. There are some whole groups of plants like the conifers, the cycads that have been assessed, and in the neotropical region, the cacti have been assessed from A to Z. And that's very interesting because a global assessment allows us to look at the plants in a much more complete way than if you just go around the country and look at the things that look endangered and assess only those. So the value of a global assessment is very clear for me. So I'm going to talk about the global assessment, challenges, survival in collections, and some examples of reintroduction that I managed to find here. Obviously, I'm Brazilian and I work with Brazilian plants and Brazilian cacti, so I'm sorry that everything seems to be driving towards my own country. But back to the global assessment, this is Barbara Gage, who assembled a group of about 400 cactus specialists and helped us all get our heads around the IUCN categories and concepts. And that led us to the understanding of how many cacti are endangered, quite a lot of them. In a family of 1,500, we have a high percentage of cacti that are endangered. And also, Barbara was doing a PhD at that moment, so she was looking at what were the factors that led to the threat of the cacti. And for example, we had smallholder ranching in two interesting regions of southern Brazil, northeastern Brazil, and also in Mexico. We had wood agroindustry here in C, showing much more in southern Brazil and Uruguay and Argentina. Nomadic grazing that was affecting much more an area of Mexico, and annual smallholder farming, which was general in the areas of endangered cacti. It was also a high incidence of those activities. We also had the total cactus diversity to the left compared with the threatened species hotspots. And that was a very enlightening situation where we could see that the hotspots corresponded somewhat to parts of the cactus diversity. So planning is very important, and those IUCN assessments are a very important part of the plans. This was the team that assembled in Brazil after the first assessments, and we also produced a conservation plan highlighting the most important cacti that were focused at that moment. You can see all of us very young there because this was 2011, it's many years ago now. But all of us, all the people who are in the picture, are still in the picture working with conservation and taxonomy of cacti systematics as well. Barbara went on to continue her studies, and she did also a global gap analysis showing how the conservation of cacti is left uncovered by the priority areas, by the conservation units. So here you can see the cacti that are critically endangered and the endangered ones that have a huge white patch, which is those cacti are not included in any preserved, any conserved area. So that's very worrying what she found out there. And she also has shown it globally from all the neotropical area where the cacti occur. To our left here, we have the areas that have some protection, and to the left, you can see the hotspots where very little protection is provided to those habitats of cacti. And you can see also that 32% of the threatened cacti are not in protected areas. Is comparable to the amphibians that are 26%, birds 19%, and then mammals 16%. So you can see that the cacti, and that's interesting because the cacti stay put. So if the preserved area is right on top of their distribution, they will be included, unlike those animals that move much more, and sometimes it's difficult to decide where to prioritize the area. Anyhow, is not what is being done. And the challenges to the cacti, one of the challenges that most people who have cactus have seen cacti in the markets and so on, people are aware that those plants are like orchids. They get stolen from the field, they get smuggled into other countries, and there is a set of legislations to guarantee that this doesn't happen. So every so often we have news like this where cacti are found in tins and boots and in the luggage of some person who's trying to smuggle them out of the country. So this is one of the main extinction risks of the very small size globular ornamental cacti. We also have situations where for 90 years nobody looks at the habitat, and this is Micranthocereus polyanthus, and we went to see where it occurs as an endemic plant, just to find out that the situation in the field is devastating and devastation as well. You can see at the background the aeolic farm, the wind farm, and in the front the mining of quartz, amethyst quartz in that region is leaving a lot of the area very destroyed, and then the habitat of the cactus is destroyed. So they have those two main things, main problems. One is the destruction of habitat, and the other one is the collecting, the illegal collecting of the plants in the wild. And even during the pandemics, where everybody started growing a little plant here and there, it became more of an internal trade in Brazil. We have this situation where people are offering certain plants in the internet, and people are buying them without knowing the provenance of them. The Caatinga, which is the largest dry forest of South America in the corner of Brazil, that's called the northeast of Brazil, is being destroyed systematically. So agriculture is transforming a large portion of this vegetation. You can see in the colors there, pink color is the area that is being lost for agriculture. And transform, no, the red one. And the pink one is transformed from forest to shrubs because of continuous disturbance to the habitat. So in a way, all these links with the assessment, you have the assessments, we have the information, we're able to do the assessments, but we don't seem to be able to stop the crisis. And of the 16 newly discovered species between 2004 and 2024, last 20 years, the great majority of them get the stamp of critically or endangered, and that's an eye-opener. This, for example, is Webelmania nuda, described in 2023 as critically endangered, and in the paper we managed to put all the disturbance to the habitat that's happening with mining for crystals that is overturning the very special, very delicate sandy habitat of those plants and creating this surface problem where it becomes water repellent, and then you have the plants being half buried on this newly dug soil. Problem with this plant, it was described in 2023. I have never seen its seeds so far, but I hear that this plant is being cultivated somewhere in Europe already by people who went to the habitat, and by night, apparently they went by night, and they collected fruits of this plant and took them outside the country. So the scientists haven't seen the seeds yet, but it's being grown by somebody somewhere in Europe. And the survival in collections. Well, it's a strange thing because we're always talking about our colonial past here in Brazil and how the collections of dry plants and sometimes living plants happen to be in other countries. This is a nice example of how a collection of cacti can be used by scientists and for reintroduction in the heart of Rio de Janeiro Botanic Garden. So there is this very hopeful situation in which cacti are preserved, they are alive, they may even be extinct in the wild, but they're kept alive so that in the hope that we can reintroduce them in the future. But cacti in collections you have to be very careful with because, for example, this is a Melocactus specimen pollinated by a lovely hummingbird, this Chlorostrilbum lucidum, and it's doing its rounds. But that means that if I'm going to produce pure fruit of a cactus, I have to make them wear a shield so that the hummingbird doesn't pollinate them. So every afternoon when they open their flowers, I can go with a paintbrush and pollinate the plants of the right species, not allowing the hummingbird to produce hybrids in my collection. So other nice example of things that we can do in a very small scale is the preservation of plants of Coleocephaloceros purpureus. Another critically endangered plant is endangered because it's the stone where it grows. You can see these rocks. They are pink granite and is extracted in large quantities to cover the large, expensive skyscrapers throughout the world. So this plant we have brought a few things to the collection, and you can see that it's flowering and fruiting, and inside the fruit you can see the seeds. And this is what we are doing to a series of species that we know are very endangered. And we're doing it in a domestic way because I worked in the UK for 25 years. I worked for several universities, but now I'm starting to retire. So this is my dream retirement job. When the disco cactus flower, I can have the fun of pollinating the seed promise. And the seeds are being sent to seed banks, which are ex situ facilities that are often linked with botanic gardens or with agricultural facilities, where those seeds can be preserved for a better moment, for a moment for production, always a chance. And we can see that there are some interesting examples of reintroduction in Brazil, illegally seized plants of Melocactus violaceus have been reintroduced in the Restinga environment by the coast in Espírito Santo. And you can also see that it's not all hunky-dory. Somebody mentioned 10 years for a conservation plan, a reintroduction plan to understand whether it's working or not. And here you can see a lot of the cacti being affected by illnesses. Those are the cacti that were reintroduced. So it needs a close following. It's not just a case of, okay, we'll plant them back there and they'll do their thing. And sometimes nature takes its course. Melocactus deinacanthus is one of the most endangered cacti of eastern Brazil. And it was growing in a quarry. And after they finish, they cease the work in the quarry, these plants are taking over again. So they haven't left the habitat completely. So there is hope that if a place like that is now fenced and looked after, those plants won't disappear from a site. This is a seedling, so there's lots of recruitment as well. And other good stories also from nature is that sometimes an area that is considered finished for a cactus, you may have seeds in the seed bank and they may return. It's easier for the cacti to actually return to the place where they were colonizing than for you to take cacti from a rock environment and try to grow them in another rock or on the soil. So you need to know a lot more about how the cacti grow in order to reintroduce them. So this is the fruiting specimen of this Melocactus conoides that we found recently. Critically endangered still, I'm not taking him down from the list because of that. It's only one population. And we also publish about small projects we have. One of them is this with this yellow flowered cactus that doesn't look like a cactus, Levenbergeria aureiflora. We have collected roots and cuttings from wild populations around the place where we live. It was pandemic time. Everybody was wearing masks there in the photo. And we managed to produce thousands of seeds of this plant for sending to the seed bank in Brasilia. And this is Cereozingens, a recently described species, where we also managed to produce seedlings and plant them outdoors in a place very close to the type location. It's not very easy to find those places. That's one of the difficulties, that sometimes the place is so destroyed that you cannot find a place where you think your plant to be safe. But this is a private reserve, and we have planted some of those plants there, and we'll be following them to see how they develop. But for all the cacti, we always think that all those cacti in those collections throughout the world, whether they have any chance of ever returning to their habitat. And for that, you mustn't be innocent. There are very major challenges for a cactus to return to its habitat. So they live very often in botanic gardens. And they survived in collections. Some of those species survived, so some of those species survived for many years, and they still have very sound provenance data. That's very important if you're reintroducing anything, that the plant has provenance data so that you can reintroduce it in the correct place. But sometimes those collections are also endangered. And we can say about the survival of the collections. Collections are very expensive. While a herbarium collection is expensive to maintain, a living collection, one oversight, one winter without heating, one very hot summer, no watering, no adequate water quality, may kill a lot of the plants. So the survival of the collections is very key if we're going to reintroduce plants to the wild. And the survival of other people is also very important. Here I just brought two examples of colleagues I had. Joseph has already deceased. Carlos is getting very gray. So people who are allowed to work within an institution and to do their job, that is caring for plants day in, day out, because that cannot be, passed to another person, and they have the knack of reproducing plants that are very difficult, are becoming increasingly rare. They don't quite fit in one profession or the other. They're not plant scientists because they're practitioners. They're like plant doctors. And I think one of the major problems we have is that those people are being discouraged, if not encouraged, from working in their plants. Every so often I hear from them, now they want me to manage 5 people. But what they want to do and what they are good at doing is the care for the plant collections that are under their responsibility. So this is important to see that people have a vocation like them. And at the moment, I don't see us growing many people like that in our institutions. We're becoming very full of regulations and other things. And talking of regulations, cacti are under this regulation called CITES that prevents them from coming and going through borders. in some countries, even seeds are not allowed to come and go across borders. And I've shown you all the colonial past and how many rich collections in the global north are decreasing in importance. And there is a problem that they cannot send seeds of those plants directly to us. It's very difficult to develop research in cacti and orchids because we need to obey to all those regulations. It's very important to have the regulations to stop the illegal trade, but when the regulation starts regulating the scientists, there seems a bit pointless to have so many rules. For example, why can't the cacti that were collected in one country come back to the country without too many pieces of red tape attached to them? That's something that I think is something we should be thinking of. The possibilities of reintroduction. I managed to put the Leonbergeria back in a place where it's close to its habitat, the is very close to its habitat as well, but if the habitat of the plant is obliterated to this level and is always endangered, it's very difficult to bring the cacti back to the field to their appropriate location. And cacti are very sensitive to the type of rock and the type of habitat where they grow. So this is a bit disheartening. On the other hand, I think we have to keep, an optimistic point of view and try to do, even if it's like little steps, we can still reintroduce plants to the wild whenever we see an opportunity. I think that's all I have to say to you.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for that inspiring talk, that it was very integrative of the many issues that we can do, many things that we can do to conserve plants. Our last speaker is Jonas Gelman from the University of Copenhagen. And his title is, "What Does Conservation Success Look Like?" So welcome, Jonas, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So my area of expertise is protected areas, and I generally have sort of a global approach to this. So looking at very large scale patterns, which are often very general and don't always fit to the very local examples. But I think that's part of the important story here. So just starting with sort of a bit of a good news, there was the Biodiversity and Business report that just came out from IPBES that showed that we're spending around $220 billion a year into conservation and restoration. And this is, of course, a very large amount and a very amazing story. But of course, it also has to be kept up with the other part of that report, which is that we're spending about 7.3 trillion a year in subsidies and public and private spending that is actually negative for biodiversity. So overall, for every dollar we spend on saving nature, we're spending roughly $33 destroying it. And this is, I think, part of the complication of actually thinking about what conservation success looks like. What is the forces that we are up against? What is it that the actions we're taking should be measured against in terms of those enormous pressures that are also on biodiversity at the same time? And within the area that I'm working with, this is also some of the questions we're very interested in. If we're looking over time at just the amount of land that we have protected, we can see that that's increasing, both for terrestrial protected areas, where we've now protected at the global level around 17 or 18%. That's more than the entire continent of South America and the entire continent of Australia together. So it's not a small amount of the world that we protected. And within the marine protected area, marine realm, we can also see a massive increase in the coverage of protection. But of course, the question that I'm interested in is protecting enough to actually achieve conservation success? Or what are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about in terms of these protected areas? And that basically boils down to these two questions, right? Not just whether we're protecting a lot of area, but whether we're protecting the right places and whether those places that we're protecting are actually making a difference, whether we're having an impact. And this is, I didn't even think about that when preparing this talk, but this coincided with a paper that just came out where I'm trying to link this sort of to the idea of whether thinking about 30 by 30 is actually a counterproductive way of thinking about protection, because it ignores these two fundamentally important questions. And what I wanted to do with this talk is sort of go through some of the examples to look at whether this success of protecting massive amounts of land has nuances to it that are important to consider as well. So we're looking at whether we're protecting the right places. One study that we did some years ago was trying to look at all of the data that was available in the red list back then. So this is over 10 years ago. And trying to do one of these classical gap analysis, looking at whether species that were assessed in the red list were sufficiently protected. And what we see here is that the green parts, the dark green, are the threatened species, the light green are the non-threatened species, and the same for the dark blue and light blue and dark red and light red. What we see here is that there's not a great overlap between where we've located the protected areas and where we actually see the most threatened species. And there's even more species that are not protected at all than there are species that are sufficiently protected. So while we've managed to protect a large amount of land, we're still not managing to actually locate these protected areas in the places where they make the biggest difference for biodiversity, where we have most of these species. So just protecting isn't equivalent to success if we're not protecting the right places. We've also, in a more recent study led by a PhD student of mine, Catherine Pulido-Charid, looked at this, asking a similar question, but for threats. So what we did there was also using the red list to generate maps of threat intensity for more than 30,000 species. So we could, for every single taxa where we've looked at, and this is the classical terrestrial vertebrates, amphibians, birds, mammals, and reptiles, we could look at the threat intensity and how that overlapped with protected areas, looking at more than 250 protected areas. And what we saw here is that if we look at those lands that are most threatened, more than 75% of those areas are not sufficiently covered with protected areas. So this is what we see in the top bar, that the high threat areas have quite small coverage of protected areas. And more generally, if we look at it across these taxa, we can see that there is not a great correlation between the threat intensity as measured on the y-axis and the coverage of protection as measured on the x-axis. If anything, for some taxa, there's actually a negative relationship, so that those areas under the greatest amount of threat are also those areas that have the least amount of protection. So similarly here, just protecting more isn't equivalent to success if we're not targeting those threats that we actually expect protection to reduce. And while it's difficult here to say what is actually leading to one another, these patterns do suggest that we are not sufficiently targeting those areas with the largest amount of threat. Another question that we're really interested in is also this other question of, are we actually protecting the right way? This is the question of whether protected areas are actually making a difference, whether they're having an impact. And this is actually a fairly complicated question. So to understand if protected areas are working, we need to understand if they're making a difference, right? If they're having an impact, if the fact that we've established them have led to a different outcome, to nature being protected in a different way than if we hadn't protected. And because we're looking at existing protected areas that are already established, we can't really do this in a laboratory setting. So we need to create these counterfactuals by asking what would have happened in the absence of protection. Can we find places that are similar to protected areas, but that have not been protected, and see what's going on there? And the reason why we do this, the reason why it's complicated to study these impacts, is actually related to the first part. The fact that protected areas are not located randomly in the landscape. The fact that we're thinking about where to put them, either where there's high biodiversity, high threat, or we're not thinking sufficiently about it because we're thinking about where they're just the cheapest to implement. That whole planning process that goes into where we locate protected areas is making them non-random in the landscape. And that's making them difficult to actually study as a conservation intervention. So what we need to do here is create these counterfactual approaches where we address the location bias and where we try to isolate the effect of protection from all the other effects that are linked to where the protected area is actually located. And one of the studies that we tried to do this, a very large study led by Hannah Wauchope, was looking at 27,000 water bird population time series from more than 1,500 protected areas, where we had data before and after they were established. We had similar areas outside where we also had data before and after that time where the protected areas were established. And this allowed us to run these matching analysis where we could compare the outcome inside the protected areas to the outcomes in these controls. And we then developed these 11 impact scenarios, which are not so important to look at the details, but the idea here is that we're trying to understand what would be signals between the inside and the outside, between the before and after, that would suggest that we've actually had a negative impact, which are the red, different types of no impact, which are the yellow, the whites, and the gray, or positive impact, which is the blue colors. And then we looked at all of these comparisons across all of these 27,000 water bird population in 1,500 areas. And what we saw was this: if we see the top, we see for each of these 1,500 sites, the proportion of bird population that falls in each of these different categories. And what we see in the bottom is the different species and the same thing. And what this tells us is actually that only about a third of the populations were observing positive impacts. And we observed very large variation, where actually in a large majority of, not a large majority, but in the majority of cases, there was no impact. And there was even quite a lot of situations where there were negative impact. And this kind of variation, of course, is great if this was a scientific study. But if we're trying to actually understand the conservation intervention that we're hoping actually is having an impact, this is less great. When we try to look at that variation and what actually explained it, we see that in the models where we try to sort of separate out what is variables that are indicative of being basically a blue population or a red population, the overwhelmingly most important indicator of being a blue population, so a population that had a positive impact of protection, was that there was management for the water birds. This is a global study, so the way we could model management is quite coarse. It's simply whether the sites had in that designation something related to birds. So whether these were protected areas that were actually set up for birds. So this is not a very detailed exploration of what that management looks like, but at the overarching level, we could see that where protected areas were managed more directly for water birds, they had a positive impact. So this at least gives us an indication of something that's maybe not rocket science in terms of what we should be looking for, but important to not forget when we're trying to just increase the area of protection. We've also tried to dig a little deeper into this with a South American or Latin American sort of case where we actually had more high quality data on some of these things we really wanted to understand, in this case, funding and governance. So this is a study led by Janet Lesman, where we looked at deforestation patterns inside and outside protected areas. And then we tried to look at what were actually the determining factors of differences in deforestation. What was, again, things that separated protected areas that had low deforestation compared to their control, their outside, and areas that had high deforestation compared to their control. And we looked at this both at the whole country level for all of these countries, and we looked at it for within Ecuador, And what was unique about this study was that we actually had information about funding. So we actually knew from the different networks of protected areas how well funded and how adequately funded these sites were. And what we could see when we looked at this, again, this variation in these sites, what actually explained the effectiveness of protected areas was that if we look at this at a system level, we see that governance, in this case measured as Human Development Index, played a big role. So countries with a higher level of education, lower level of poverty, were doing better overall than countries that had lower level governance. And if we looked at the site level, we could see that the funding came in. So what we think we're seeing is this nested nature of you need national level structures of good governance to work in a place before the importance of funding comes in and plays a role at the local level. Okay, so coming to an end, just to summarize, while we're seeing an increase in the coverage of protected areas, we're also seeing that many of them are actually not tracking biodiversity sufficiently, they are not tracking threats sufficiently, and they're not sufficiently making a difference for those features of biodiversity that they are actually set up to protect. And that without good governance, sufficient capacity, funding, management, human resources, we're not seeing those outcomes. So we have to think about that. And what I think this really should sort of make us think about is that this idea of just protecting more and more is really not going to work to achieve conservation success if we're not also committing the resources and the know-how of those that we need to put into the protected areas to make them effective. And this idea of just assessing protected areas by how they on average is working is really ignoring the fact that there's so many confounding factors that we need to think about that are either making protected areas effective or not effective, and really trying to explore these things, trying to explore those best practices, those exceptional responders, or bright spots, is what we need to do to actually start understanding what are the mechanisms we need to transfer to other protected areas to make them effective, and what are the kind of thinking we need to evolve to maybe focus more on fewer but better protected areas rather than just thinking of protecting a third of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that talk, Jonas. It was, like all the others, very eye-opening. We have covered very broad perspectives for global conservation initiatives. And I would like now to invite our moderator for the discussion portion, Anahita Simoes. She's a research scientist from Missouri Botanical Garden in charge of Africa and Madagascar, and she's housed at the Paris Herbarium. So welcome, Anahita, and you can take on the stage.
Thank you, Alejandro. Just to clarify that I'm not in charge of the Africa and Madagascar department. No, I work for the Africa and Madagascar department. Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to all the speakers for your very amazing, insightful presentations. I will add a little bit, just a quick intro, which is a bit of my view. So I just a quick thought on this, that I think we're seeing that biodiversity conservation sometimes feels a bit like a losing battle in terms of time, that it feels a bit like a hectic race against time. We are trying to get to a point, but we don't always get there as quick as we can or as we would like. We're trying to save what's already so close to being lost, or things are being lost even before we get to them. And it has an impact on species diversity, on the balance of ecosystems, but also on human livelihoods, because inevitably there are natural resources that we depend on, and these are also at risk. And I just wanted to remind that I think it's easy to forget that in many countries, people still depend very directly on the available natural resources. So medicine is not easily available, at least the processed medicines. People depend on medicinal plants and on small farming. And all of this is also affected by the loss of species because they lose diversity of these resources that they have available. So there's different reasons why we should be worried about losing biodiversity so quickly and at such a big scale. So my first question is, and I'm just going to put the question out there and then choose a victim, and then we take it from there. But my first question is: Are we too late? Are we not too late? Shouldn't we not be worried about the time aspect, running more against the time? But to put it in another way, do we need to change how we're doing conservation, thinking more of the short term, and what should we be doing differently, or should we be prioritizing things that we're not prioritizing at the moment? So how can we make conservation approaches not just more impactful, but also more time efficient? And then I see Christina nodding. I'm going to start with her because I wanted to ask actually about the red listing. So it's inevitable. We spend so much time on the red listing, and do you want to tell us a bit? I mean, what do you think? I mean, I'm not going to put red listing on the spot, but as an example of a very time-consuming task. And so what do you feel, Christina? There's things we could be doing differently to be more time efficient, or things we should be prioritizing. What do you want to say about that? If you want to say something.
No, yes, I understand your feeling. I think for many of us, sometimes this feels overwhelming because, as you said, there's so many things happening. But I think in all the talks, we actually saw that things that are happening. Jonas was talking about, more finance in conservation, and Jeff and Sapi were presenting cases in which we are doing things. But to your point, I think what we need to do is to keep doing what we're doing well. So we need to do a lot more assessing, but also planning and assessing the impact and making recommendations, like everybody was saying in these talks. But at the same time, we need to improve on the implementation, because people tend to think sometimes that of course we need the information as best as we can before acting, but we can also start acting in many cases without enough information. So we just need to keep doing both. And obviously we need more resources. I mean, I always tell my students and everybody that we know what to do. We know what, in many cases, the approaches that are best suited for conservation success. We just need to scale it up because many of our efforts are relatively low scale, small scale. So we just need to keep going and to do more and to listen to the recommendations and do it better. I know it sounds like, it's like a very general answer, but that's what we need. And in many countries and in many places, I see progress. I see a lot of progress. It's just that we need to scale it up, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. Jeff, do you want to complement that? I saw you putting a comment in the chat. Do you just want to complement what Christina was saying? Thank you, Christina.
What I thought when you said, "Are we too late?" We have a saying in the United States. I don't know if other countries have this as well. When's the best time to plant a tree? 30 years ago, but the second best time is today. And I'll also use climate change as an example. So to what I say to my students, where we have so much in the media about, we have 5 years to solve this, as if there's some binary, yes, no. And conservation, it's not true. Of course, every molecule of carbon dioxide we keep out of the atmosphere helps. And the same is true for conservation. Every bit we do helps. And so acting like we're too late, we can't do anything, is just a false paradigm.
Thank you. Well, I also really like what Christina was saying. I don't know if all of you would agree, or if you, Jeff, would agree that we could try acting when we have enough information instead of sometimes waiting to have information that is not going to change the action. So that's maybe something that can help us go quicker in terms of the action, in terms of the implementation, to move from the paper to the action a bit quicker sometimes. I don't know if you think that's an issue or not, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's not. But okay, thank you. I'll leave it to that. Thank you both. Thank you. I will move on to just one question, because I think I was going to aim at Jeff. Maybe Jeff, you can follow up on that one, and then maybe Jonas and Daniela can complement. So also different countries and different regions have unavoidably different conservation priorities, or they have sometimes varying degrees of awareness of the need to do biodiversity conservation, or motivation or support from the public or support from the government. That varies a lot between countries. We know that, depending on culture, on economic factors, and especially in countries of what the so-called global south, which there's not the same availability of resources that can be invested in these priorities. So how do we think we can overcome these disparities when it comes to conservation, just to make sure that we have more impactful and effective strategies, but at a global scale? How we can make sure that we even that out at a global scale? I think you kind of gave us the answer already, but maybe you have something to say.
This was to me?
Yes, if that's all right.
That's tough. I mean, I think that, what Jonas mentioned this too, funding's tough. But one inexpensive thing, it's easy for me to say inexpensive because it obviously could cost time, but is for neighboring countries to just have ongoing conversations. And in that way, I think that you can wind up building these relationships so that there is more shared understanding, so that when a new plan comes up, when there's some opportunity or something like that, that there are these relationships and you don't have to start from scratch. So I think that talk to your neighbors is both banal and oversimplistic, but I think it's also profound.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Does anyone want to complement that? Maybe Jonas, and then Daniela, if you'd like to say something. Jonas? Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, and not one that's super easy to answer, because I think there's a lot of different dynamics going into this question, right? That both relates to where does the impact actually originate from? What are the underlying drivers, and where do they come? And where is the actual impact occurring? And then at the same time, this complication of not trying to prescribe solutions for other contexts and other people. So thinking of my own country of Denmark, I think one of the things that is very clear there is that to grow all of the pigs that we're growing in Denmark, we need an area the size of Denmark outside of Denmark, right? So there is it's understanding that sort of supply chain logic and what that means for conservation in other places, because I think we're quite unaware of how large of an impact we're having in other places. And if that's the case, actually dealing with it becomes difficult, right? Because there's lack of knowledge and there's lack of understanding of where it actually occurs. So I would say one of the big reasons, funding obviously is one of them, but also thinking about consumption and how that globally looks like, where it's originating from and where it's coming to, or where it's going to, is critically important for actually understanding how to actually mitigate it from across the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jonas. Do you want to add something, Daniela?
Totally agree with Jonas. I'm at the other end. You're consuming there, and we're producing here, and there is a very strong link between what's produced and what's exported and what's consumed, and the destruction of the environment. A country that lives on commodities like mine is in the spotlight for those things, and often blamed to be guilty of evils when the extraction force is coming from outside. There are some examples already of the consumers, especially European ones, Scandinavian ones, even better than others, checking where their products are coming from and how are they produced. Of course, the industry always gets in the way and gets clever and starts greenwashing all their products, but I think it's a worthy initiative.
Yeah, thank you.
And Maria Rita, if I can also complement the answers, I agree with all the answers. Also, I would say we need to be more pragmatic, because as we were saying before, we do have a lot of strategies and recommendations, and we do know a lot about what needs to be done. But obviously, in each country, in each region, we need to be very aware of the context. And I want to mention, for example, in Latin America, there's a lot of interest in raising people from poverty and providing better access to health and education. So we need to take that into account. I mean, my country is very interested in helping, local communities in those places where there's a lot of biodiversity. So let's work together. I mean, like, take advantage of the interest that is already there. And let's and give the message, if we work for biodiversity conservation and in general environmental issues, we can actually help you with the social targets, for example, that you have in many countries. So let's be strategic and pragmatic and understand the local context, so we can actually say, look, we can work together and we can help biodiversity at the same time as we're helping humans, because it's the same thing. I mean, they're not separate issues. So I think we need to learn to be more pragmatic in that way.
Thank you, Cristina. I will have to pass on the moderation to Alejandra and to Mariana. Thank you for this session. Thank you so much. Alejandra still has the notes of my last question if everyone is up for an extension. Otherwise, I can pass on to Mariana to get a question from the public, and I'll have to say goodbye to everyone. Thank you so much for the session. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Mariana, do we have a question?
Oh, yeah, Alejandra. You're mute, Alejandra. I think she wants to add something.
Thanks a lot, Anahita, and have a good evening over there in Paris. And Mariana, are there any questions from the public that we want to share?
Yeah, we had one from Edgar from Philippines. It says, what measurable ecological, economic, and social management outcomes define successful conservation of threatened species and ecosystems?
Very in-depth question. Can Jonas answer or give us some thoughts?
I'm happy to give it a try. I think Cristina might also have something to add there. So when we look at protected areas, I guess some of the things, and I don't know if this is actually addressing the question, but what I'm sort of thinking about is that what we're looking at is whether there's a difference, right? So it's looking at whether populations of species have changed their distribution to inhabit more of the protected area, whether the number of individuals are increasing so that they're actually in a more healthy state than they've been. But I don't know if that is sort of, I'm just thinking of the types of data that we're trying to look for when we're doing these analysis at a more large scale approach, but I'm not sure if that's actually getting at the core of the question.
Cristina?
So if you're talking about measuring, let's say, the success in terms of biodiversity outcomes, of course, you can measure population viability in the case of a species. In the case of ecosystems, you can measure ecosystem function. If you're talking about the landscape level, you can talk about, integrity, connectivity. I mean, there are many parameters that you can use to see if you're actually improving, let's say, the status of biodiversity. But as Rita was saying, we also can measure ecosystem services or contributions of nature to people. So we can actually measure, if the human well-being is being improved by conservation outcomes. So we can also use those type of measures, but obviously that's a little bit more difficult. And to demonstrate that, the direct contribution of biodiversity to human well-being is a little bit trickier. But I think, again, if you take a more integral view, you can actually measure, if human well-being is being improved because of conservation and vice versa. So, yeah. I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but.
Daniela, do you have any cases of success that you can share with us about the conservation of cacti, besides the ones that nature was already put in there where they should
Yeah,
be?
those ones we don't even know how long they are going to remain. But the important thing is to be doing it and to actually have an opportunity to put your hands on the materials and trying to do it, not only because it's going to affect one population, but because we still don't have enough information about how to grow them outdoors and in their habitat and how to monitor. And we only started maybe 10 years ago, so I don't have many success stories, but lots of good starts. I think is more like it. But I was quite interested in that the last question is very tricky. Maybe tourism and ecotourism has some something to contribute to conservation that we are overlooking. People want to see those plants and flowers and hummingbirds in nature, so that could be a good thing.
I just want to round up with Jeff. And so how does conservation success look when you're talking about invasive species? Are we gaining the battle again against any of those that you know of?
Yeah, I think that it's an ongoing problem. I grew up in California, not even realizing that most of the plants that I grew up around were not native, and in a sense, we have moved past in terms of what are we going to focus on to trying to deal with new invaders that are coming in. And I think that's unfortunately a reality. I think that understanding ways in which I continually have debates with myself about the novel ecosystems concept about should we tolerate some non-native species if they aren't doing anything to the ecosystem. So I think that we are aware of the fact of paying attention to the species that are in terms of the invasive species that are having the largest impact, and trying very much to protect those biodiversity hotspots, islands, and so forth that are especially important for global biodiversity.
Okay, so thank you very much. Conservation is it's an endurance. It's an endurance race. It's not 100-meter fast race. So we are all in this for long. I would like to thank a lot our speakers today and also our moderator who took some effort, everyone to be here. I'd like to thank our audience to be here. We will have this recording available on our association's website for you to share with anyone who is interested. We hope to bring other interesting talks like this in collaboration across associations. And please feel free to email any of us if you have questions for our speakers, and we can share their contact address. I'm sure that many connections that come out of this will be very good. And we'll round up here because time flies, and we'll heard very interesting talks, and now it's time for continue our day. So thanks a lot to everyone. And I also want to thank especially Mariana Soto and Gustavo Shimizu from ATBC and IAPT who made this possible. So thanks a lot to everyone for all your support. I'll see you in another time.
Thank you.
Thank you
It was
for
very nice.
inviting us.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.